Chapter 2 quiz. So before we dive right in, keep in mind we're dealing with the difference between a product cost and a period cost. Product cost, that's your direct materials, your direct labor, and your factory overhead. You might hear product costs referred to as manufacturing costs, so keep in mind those are used interchangeably. All right. So when we're taking a look at this, product costs are anything that have to do with getting the product ready to basically be distributed and sold, right? So if we're in a manufacturing company, which most of our examples in this class will be, we are dealing with steps of the manufacturing process. If we're a retailer, we're dealing with the costs that we incur in order to actually get the product so we can sell it. So in this case, when we're looking at these ones, indirect labor is a product cost, and that would be considered factory overhead. The assembly line worker's wages, that's a product cost, that would be direct labor. And then the factory supervisor's salary, that is a product cost, it's factory overhead. The only one that isn't a product cost there is the accountant's salary, that would be a period cost. Oops. Number 2, they're asking for us to calculate all of the manufacturing overhead. Remember, manufacturing overhead, I'm going to redo that little thing I did up above. Product cost is direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. So manufacturing overhead is the same thing as factory overhead. So what they want us to grab in this case is they want us to grab everything that's considered factory overhead. So first things first, let's just for good practice, let's go down the list and determine what's a product cost. This one's a product cost. Indirect labor, that's a product cost. Customer service department depreciation, that would be considered a period cost. Factory depreciation, product cost. Store depreciation, that's a period cost. Store rent, period cost. Direct labor, that's a product cost. Indirect materials, product cost, and direct materials are product costs. Now, one other thing that I just want to touch on is the difference between like materials and inventory versus supplies. So when you think of supplies, think office supplies, things like pen and paper. So if we say, oh, it's supplies, that's not necessarily what is going into manufacturing the good. The things that are going into manufacturing the good is in materials inventory, right? So if we're producing something that has to be glued together, that particular glue that's going to be used in the manufacturing process, that's going to be in our materials inventory, most likely in raw materials inventory is what we'll call it. But if it's glue, like Elmer's glue, that's going to be, I shouldn't even say Elmer's glue. What do we use in an office with glue? I don't know, a glue stick, because I don't know why we would have a glue stick, but if it's just a glue stick we're using in the office for administrative work, that's different. That's supplies, right? So those are very different items. So supplies would not ever be direct materials. Okay. Supplies typically are either going to be factory overhead if they're in the factory. So if we're using pens, paper, pencils within the factory, that would be factory overhead. That would be a product cost. If they are supplies that are being used at the corporate headquarters or for the accountant, pens, papers over there, that would be a period cost. So we have to pay close attention there. All right, back on topic. So here we have manufacturing overhead is what they're looking for. So let's go through these 6 product costs and determine which ones are factory overhead. Remember, if it's not direct materials and it's not direct labor, it must be factory overhead. So factory rent, that's factory overhead. Indirect labor, it's not direct materials, it's not direct labor, so it must be factory overhead. Factory depreciation, it's not direct materials or direct labor, so it must be factory overhead. Direct labor, boom. Indirect materials, that's one. And then direct materials, that's our other one. Let me go slow with my calculator because, oh, look, you can even see earlier me trying and I was going way too fast. 12 plus 4, 26. There you go. All right, let's take a look at number 3. Which of the following is most likely to be a fixed cost? Remember, fixed costs are those costs that aren't going to change just because you produced one more unit, right? So product packaging, we're going to use more product packaging if we have one additional unit of output because we need more packaging, right? So product packaging would be variable. Rent, are we going to incur more rent just because we produce one more unit? No, we will not. So that would be fixed. Electricity, are we going to use up more electricity because we're producing an additional unit? Most likely. And I do know that there are arguments out there that might say, well, if we produce one more unit, it depends on what we're manufacturing. Yes, I know. But generally, we will usually consider electricity as either variable or mixed. It depends. Usually, I don't know, I think it's mixed, but some textbooks disagree. Assembly workers' wages. As we produce more, we obviously have to assemble more, so that is also variable. So the only one here that is fixed would be rent. All right. So here we want to find the manufacturing cost per unit. Same thing as product cost per unit. So we have direct materials. We know that's a manufacturing cost, and direct labor. And now we need overhead. But we have to be careful here. Well, we don't have to be too careful. Basically, overhead, this is manufacturing overhead, by the way. These two, overhead is usually going to have a variable component and a fixed component, right? So if we're looking for manufacturing costs, which are the same thing as your period costs, product costs. I'm going to write this little thing over and over and over again, I feel. Direct materials, direct labor, and then overhead. There's your direct materials, there's your direct labor, and then overhead will usually have a variable and a fixed component. So that's 40, 52, 57, 63. There's our answer. That was number 4, right? Okay. All right, number 5. They're asking us to find our total period costs. So I think these are very similar numbers to earlier. They might be the exact same ones. Factory rent is product. Indirect labor is product. Here's a period cost. Factory depreciation is product. Store depreciation, there's a period cost. Store rent. And then the other 3 of these are all product costs. So if we add these up, 5, 6,200, 72, 7,700, there's our answer. Sorry if you hear cawing, I'm outside. All right, let's see. Variable cost per unit. So now we have to decide what's variable. All right, direct materials are always considered variable in a textbook. Direct labor, always considered variable. Variable overhead is obviously variable. And variable selling and admin is obviously variable. Fixed is not. So moral of the story is variable is variable, whether it's a product cost or a period cost. So we're getting into some really weird overlap here, right? So when we're looking for variable, I don't care if it's period, you're including it. If it's a variable cost, you include it. They do not discriminate. All right, so 40 plus 12, 52, 57, 60, 70. Good. All right. All right, this one wants you to look for all of the indirect materials. So this one should be fun. All right, so indirect materials, steel, that would be direct. The factory supervisor's salary, that would be an indirect labor. Interesting, right? Leather, that would be a direct material. Vehicle grease. All right, so we're a car manufacturer, so we're definitely going to be using vehicle grease, but it's going to be very challenging for us to trace these costs directly to the item we are making, so that would be considered an indirect material. Wheels would be direct. We could easily figure that out. Glue, that would be an indirect as well. So remember, these indirect materials, these would be considered factory overhead, and they would just be allocated out as necessary. Assembly line workers' wages, that's direct labor, and factory custodial staff wages, that would be factory overhead. All right, so 5,200, done. All right. All right, so what are they looking for here? They want the cost of raw materials used. All right. So they're looking for a raw material item. Technically, if we were looking for raw materials used, there are two formulas that we would have to consider. Raw materials used is used in both the raw materials formula and the WIP formula. So you guys learned before the raw materials inventory formula, the WIP inventory formula, and the finished goods inventory formula. Now keep in mind, this one's a pretty easy one, and all these formulas really are is what makes raw materials go up and what makes it go down, and the same thing for WIP and finished goods. What makes it go up, what makes it go down. So if it helps, really imagine a factory that is going through the process of manufacturing the good, so on and so forth. All right, so let's see, we have, they're giving us some information which lets me know I'm going to be using the raw materials inventory formula. So they're telling us that raw materials inventory started with 4,000. So beginning raw materials was 4,000. Ending raw materials inventory was 3,000. I'll grab that in a second. And raw materials purchases was 125. So raw materials is always going to go up by 125, or by purchases, sorry. 129. All right, so we started the period with 4,000. We purchased 125,000. So this 129,000 right here, the 4,000 plus the 125,000, that 129,000 is the cost. I'm going to actually go over into this area. Cost of raw materials available for use. So this 129,000, it can either go in one of two directions, right? So it's going to get split out. Either it's used or it's left over and still an ending, right? So I'm kind of showing it a little bit differently than what we normally see, just to kind of really reiterate the fact that this cost of raw materials available for use, we just split it out into what was used and what's left over. So in this case, they gave us what was left over, and we have to find what's used. So 3,000 was left over. So how much must have been used? 126,000. All right. All right, this one's asking for cost of goods manufactured. You might ask yourself, do you always go to the end when you read these types of problems? In cost, yeah, I actually kind of do. I usually go straight for the ending. That way I can kind of think about what I'm probably going to have to deal with. So if they want us to calculate cost of goods manufactured, and I know I'm dealing with basic cost flow assumptions, cost of goods manufactured is included in our WIP formula and our finished goods formula. So we have to take a look at the information they gave us and decide which one do we have to use to figure this out. Okay. So they're giving us beginning raw materials inventory. We don't even need the raw materials. I thought, let's see. 500 raw materials, 2,000 in WIP. So actually, let me start putting some info in here. Beginning. So they gave me 2,000 in WIP. And actually, let's do this. I'm going to do the whole thing from scratch. Let me see. So for raw materials, I'll zoom in for a bit. raw materials, WIP, finished goods. Let's start with beginning. All right, so they're telling us that we have 500 in beginning raw materials. I don't know if I'm going to have to use this later, but I'm just organizing my thoughts at this point because I have no idea what's going to happen. We have 2,000 beginning WIP. At the end of the year, Raven had 1,700 in raw materials. All right, so let's hold on to that for a second. And 400 in WIP. I don't want to add that in yet, though, because I don't know what direction this is going in. If 520,000 in raw materials were purchased and 310,000 was the amount of direct labor and factory overhead during the year, what is the cost of goods manufactured? So I'm already seeing right now, I'm not even going to need finished goods formula. I'm going to have to use my WIP formula to find cost of goods manufactured, and then I'm going to have to use the raw materials formula in order to find something that needs to go into that WIP. So let's keep going. Let's look at the WIP. So when we look at WIP, we have to ask ourselves, what makes WIP go up? And for WIP, it's our manufacturing costs. And you know already, we have 3 manufacturing costs: direct material, direct labor, and then factory overhead. So when we're dealing with those 3, direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead, it's really important to remember that when they say manufacturing costs going into WIP, they're talking about direct materials used, not purchased. This is important. So they told us earlier, let me see, that direct materials purchased was 520,000. That's not what I need. I need used. So technically, I'm going to have to grab that 520,000 that was purchased. And I'm going to have to figure out how much was used. So we had 520,500 available to use. But how much did we actually use? Let's take out our end. I skipped it earlier, right? At the end of the year, they had 1,700 in raw materials inventory. It's too early in the morning. Let me grab the calculator. I probably shouldn't do that in front of you guys. Let me do the long way. 520.5. Oh my goodness gracious. There we go. Minus 1,700. So we're finding that 518,800 is what was used. So for direct materials used, 518,800. Now we need direct labor and factory overhead. And again, we're figuring out what our manufacturing costs for the period were. They actually combined these two into 310,000. So we're going to have to add those two up. I guess I could have just left that, but oh well. 828,800. Oh, Stan, you could have done that. All right, so here are our manufacturing costs added during the period. So let's go ahead and put that into our WIP formula. All right, so that 830,800 is the cost of all of the WIP that we could have completed during the period. But in this case, we need to know cost of goods manufactured. How much did we actually finish? How much was actually completed during the period? So we're going to need one more item. Let's see what it is. We need to know what the ending is. Here it is, 400. So that means that during the period, we must have manufactured 830,400. And that's our cost of goods manufactured. So as you can see, sometimes you have to go into one of the other formulas to kind of work your way backwards. And that is most likely what you're going to end up seeing on your exam. All right, let's see this last one. Oh, here we're going to work backwards, it looks like. Beginning work in process inventory. Let's see what they got. COGM. Total manufacturing costs. Ending work in process. All right. So in this case, we're going to be working backwards with that WIP formula. So let's review that WIP formula. It's beginning WIP plus the manufacturing costs added during the period. In this case, I don't know which one's easier. Let's say COGM, I guess. What makes it go up makes it go down. It doesn't really matter which direction we put the COGM in the ending. That will equal ending. So let's see what we have. They're telling us that our cost of goods manufactured is 603,000. Total manufacturing costs. And these are the total manufacturing costs that they are adding during the period, by the way. All right. And boop, boop. Ending work in process was 95. So you see we have a little bit of an algebra problem going on. So X plus 670,000 minus 603,000 equals 95,000. All right, let's do it. So first things first, let's go ahead and combine at what we have in numbers on the left-hand side. So 670 minus 603. I already lost it. 670 minus 603, that's 67. All right, and then we have to take away 67 from each side. Let's see, 70, 25, 28. So that must be our beginning inventory. There you go. All right, good work. Keep up the studying, and just give it your time, and you'll master these concepts in no time.